Hi, Father Ian VanHeusen here. I'm here with Rob Agnelli. Everybody knows you by now. We've been doing this for a while, so
That's good to be
if
back.
not, you can go look back at the older content and get more of your story.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to do a series now on spiritual warfare, spiritual combat. But can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, sure. So Lorenzo Scupoli was a 16th century monk who wrote the spiritual classic on spiritual warfare, focusing on more of the internal battle, not necessarily battling the devil, although there's a lot of stuff in there. The great thing about this book is saints recommend it. St. Francis de Sales carried it around with him, and he called it his spiritual director. So he would read a passage out of it every single day. So, when it gets a stamp of approval from saints like that, it's probably worth us digging into a little bit.
Heck yeah. Heck yeah, let's jump in. So we were talking about, actually, before we get into the first point, so I wanted to tie it in a little bit with experiences. You've had the experience of teaching teenagers how to drive.
Yeah.
I had an experience today when I was coming here where it occurred to me that the experience, the more you learn to drive, the more for example, we would never recommend a teenager take a phone call while they're driving. Whereas now I'm 40, I get a lot of phone calls in while I'm driving because I have the muscle memory, the perceptive awareness, where just a lot more aware.
Yeah.
So what's been your experience with teaching your teenagers how to drive?
Yeah, a lot of it is having awareness of your surroundings, so anticipating what other people are going to do, and then the other part is knowing your limitations.
Yeah.
Knowing, okay, if I am going too fast, in this little area right here, and I go off the road, I'm not going to be able to get back on. So
or turns, right?
Yeah.
That's a big how to handle turns.
Yes, yeah. But knowing the sort of exterior limitations, and then you're into your own ability to drive, and not being a cocksure teenager. So that little bit of distrust of self. You have to instill that in them, right? Without the problem is you can let your kids make a lot of mistakes, but sometimes making a mistake with a car, it can be
fatal.
really bad, right? Yeah,
it can be
very fatal, exactly.
Fatal and or cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember one of my first times driving, I actually went up on a curve that had it was a pedestrian curb. Luckily nobody was on it, right? But it was kind of wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. So we can talk about that. And you made a good distinction: the internal and the external environment, experience of your limitations and experience of limitations of the environment.
Yep.
What can be done with your tool, with your vehicle? Because hypothetically, you could know yourself, but you not know the limitations of the tool. So we know as an adult, even when you're in a car for the first time, you have to get the feel for how the car
it's just
works.
like NASCAR drivers, right? They're awesome drivers, but then they get on the road and there's limitations with driving around with other things that's going on, right? They can go, 180 miles an hour, not hit something, but they get on the road, it's a totally different environment.
Well, and that's where I get at, before we get into the point, I was talking about a little bit before when we were preparing, is the sense of experience, right? It's like data points. The more data points you have with experience, and that's where what we're hopefully be doing is giving you language and concepts to recognize your experience and to say, okay, that went well, that was the work of the Holy Spirit. That didn't go well, that was the enemy. That didn't go well, I need to avoid that. So the first concept to get into is this idea of distrusting yourself. And of course, immediately in our society, with its emphasis on trust yourself, trust your intuition, you're perfect the way you are, right? These are songs that we hear you're perfect just the way you are, don't change a thing about yourself, everything, self-esteem, positive mental health. The first thing people are going to jump to is this is against good mental health, or this is the opposite of the culture, but I don't think we'd go that route.
I think we've talked about this before about it's healthy to meditate on your sin, to know your sin, to know the places you fall.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Sometimes it could be.
Oh, for sure.
Work the enemy.
For sure. To do it well, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about as we were preparing, the whole key to all of this is not flipping ends and means, right? Meditating on my sin as a means, one, to understand myself, to know God's mercy. Those are good things.
Greater freedom. And it should lead to greater freedom, the greater experience of joy and happiness, right?
Yeah. But when you treat it as an end in itself, right? I wallow in it, right?
Well, and from a spiritual direction standpoint, is that there's some people it reminds them of abusive parent. So they might not trust themselves because in psychology they talk about early on there's a stage where you have to take initiative versus and so if you're not prone to take initiative, maybe there's some part of your human nature that needs to be healed. So we're not saying, this isn't saying you should never take initiative, you should always look for the affirmation of authority. It's a deeper principle, which is it can actually be more freeing, paradoxically, to take more initiative, right?
For sure.
Yeah, because what's the classic thing? We've experienced this now, Tim, with what we've done. It's kind of been an entrepreneurial activity with Art of Living Well. When you distrust yourself, you are more prone to accept the views of others. You're more prone to seek counsel, to have less the view of self-reliant, and ultimately to trust more on God, right?
Yeah, and even just simple things like that, right? Like I can think of examples in my own life where I have a tendency, I can be a little rash sometimes.
Yeah.
And I only really learned that about myself because I did it over and over, right? And I saw the repercussions of it doing.
Yeah.
And by looking at myself and being examined myself, I now know that my initial gut reaction, maybe not the best reaction. And so I'm always checking that, because while it might be psychologically satisfying to stick it to someone, in the end, am I doing what God is asking? Mm-hmm. I don't know. And so just learning that about myself by God letting me fall in those areas and then showing me like this wasn't my will. I now am way more free to respond in the way he wants me to respond rather than respond in the way that Rob wants to respond, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Well, one of the things I was thinking about this, piggybacking on it, where I had to learn to distrust myself was early on with the Art of Living Well and with Newman. When I was worried about money, I was worried about whatever, there'd be just times where I'd have kind of panic attacks. What I learned over time was this will pass.
Yeah.
Now is not a time to make a decision, not to try to force anything, just let it pass. Maybe there is something I need to work on with it related to, especially with raising money for Newman. Because, sometimes you just have bills piling up. You look at your bank account, you're like, how's this going to work out? Yeah. But you trust. So that distrust is also a distrust of maybe sometimes your raw experience. Because I think one of the biggest traps we fall into the spiritual life, I feel it, therefore it must be true. I think it, therefore it must be true. I had once an interesting dynamic. I had this person they were talking about a homily of mine that they really didn't like and they were triggered by. And the person, very nice person, many other things going on with the person in addition to what. But I remember I said to the person, I said, you clearly did not understand the homily. They were so convinced that their subjective experience of my homily was the reality of the homily. And, with modern technology, we would record it. I was like, you can go back. I didn't say what you're saying I said. I know exactly what I said. I've watched it. It was available online. And, but the person was so convinced that their subjective experience was what they had actually heard. They weren't willing to say, well, maybe I didn't actually hear what was said. Yeah. And maybe they did later. I don't know. We had a short conversation and I never followed up with there wasn't a need for follow-up. But, when you hear something, a lot of people don't jump to the conclusion. They jump to the conclusion that they perfectly understood it. They perfectly understood the intent of it. And they jump to the conclusion that they fully understand. Whereas if you had a holy distrust of yourself, you might say to yourself, well, maybe I misunderstood, or maybe I should. Yeah,
it also starts with, this is right out of St. Ignatius' playbook, right? Not every thought is your own. Not everything you think came from yourself or from the Holy Spirit, right?
Exactly.
And the devil is all too quick to get there and twist words around, twist implications around, help you draw quick conclusions.
Even when things feel good.
Yeah, and that is the reason, especially, right? Because they can play with your feelings too, right? So that's the time where, this is why self-distrust, because we can be tricked by angels of light. That's where self-distrust comes in, really important, because... You
mean angels of darkness?
Well, where they say, disguising themselves, disguising themselves as angels of light, right? Yeah. Where you say, this is a good thing. From the fourth week of the spiritual exercises, right? He talks about those second rules of discernment, because the devil often will disguise himself. And you think, this is I'm rock solid on this, right? And And that's why I use the example of me being rash, is because I had all the justifications, right? He was right there feeding them to me, like why you should act right now, why you should, and so you do have to train yourself to discern between those voices, but also to just go, you know what, I've been tricked by this before. Mm-hmm. And because I've been tricked by this before,
the devil often
just need to
overplays
step
his
back.
hand.
Yeah.
You're going to fall multiple times in the same pattern.
And
God allows that to show.
I think I've used this example before, maybe not with us talking, but a lot of times you can tell where you're very prone to get attacked by the devil by the places he overplays his hand, right? So a person that's like, it's funny, I use this example and no one would ever admit to it, but I'm like, okay, if you're prone to a little bit of anger, watch what the devil tempts you to do sometimes. Sometimes he tempts you to do some ridiculously angry things, like grab the steering wheel when you're arguing with someone in the car, or he'll overplay the hand, and you're like, oh, if you're watching, you're like, that's not my idea, and you realize, okay, someone else is feeding me ideas, and I need to that's a place where I'm obviously prone. He just went too far, and he loses nothing by doing that.
And going back to this self-knowledge, self-distrust is. I had an experience where I was in confession. I'm not revealing anything that's related at all. You will never. I don't even know who the person was. So you can't figure out who the person was because I don't even remember who the person was. No idea who they were. I just remember this insight I had. The person said, "Well, I don't know. I'm not they weren't prepared for confession." I said, the honest thing, what I've seen with holiness, the holier the person is, they can go through the 7 deadly sins and know exactly how they would fall. They could guess, you could anticipate, this is where I would be prone. This is how I might fall in this particular area. And this can be very freeing, right? Because then if you know yourself and you have good defenses, then you know how to guard your heart a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. But I've thought about that with the 7 deadly sins and with other things, which is also why meditating on these things can be helpful, because you give structure to it, you give language to it. So you say, okay, here are the ways that I fall with pride. Here are the ways I fall with greed, with lust, with envy, with anger, whatever it might be. One thing I did want to go back to a little bit, because you mentioned it quickly, and I just for our listeners, because they might have been like, what were they talking about right there? So the rules of discernment. So briefly, I'm just going to, St. Ignatius in the exercises has rules for the first week of the exercises, the second week of the exercises. And the idea is to discern the work of the Holy Spirit from the work of the enemy. First week rules are consolation. This was I love talking about this. Consolation from desolation. So we all recognize that there's desolation and thought traps and negative feelings. The second week rules, which you alluded to, is a really good point, is in the second week rules, it's false consolation from true consolation.
Right.
So that is, we can feel good, we can even have some modicum of peace, but it's not the work of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And it could be a temporary peace, a temporal peace for a time and a season. I think it's particularly important right now because of the heavy emphasis on, with praise and worship music, with on intuition, with some of those folks like in charismatic renewal. Sometimes people get this sense of, well, if I experience peace, therefore it must be good.
Yeah, I mean, I get peace whenever I get what I want a lot of times. Right? It's not a good indicator, right?
That could be a danger, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a good indicator.
But that's where the whole idea of natural versus supernatural. You can have I once was talking to somebody in spiritual direction who struggled a little bit with drinking because they were dealing with stress, and they they would drink a bottle of wine. I said, well, you feel good afterwards, right? It does relieve the pressure. And even they might, if you like let's say, you have really stress and you down a bottle of wine, you might feel good that night and you might feel better the next morning for a while.
Yeah.
And then you try it again, and then you try it over and over again, but then you get diminishing returns. Yeah. So getting back to this idea that peace can come from multiple places.
Ultimately what you're saying is you got to look for the fruits after, right?
Yeah, that's
ultimately, right? Just where does it actually lead me? And is it leading me towards God or away from God?
Yeah. I'm wondering if we should visit, because we're at the end of this session, if we should revisit this distrust. We'll figure it out for the next session. We'll take a break. Good for you guys to join us. Father Ian VanHeusen here with Rob Agnelli. And we should probably call this something at some point, but we don't have a name for it now. Good to join us, guys.